Some people think the biggest mistake a neighbor can make is calling the HOA over your mailbox or complaining about your grass being half an inch too tall. They're wrong. The biggest mistake is touching land you don't actually understand. Because sometimes the quiet guy next door knows a whole lot more than he lets on. The afternoon my fence disappeared, my neighbor thought he'd just won the easiest property dispute of his life. What he really did was uncover a legal record that would eventually erase $85,000 from his own bank account. My name is Daniel Mercer, and until all of this happened, I had lived on Maple Ridge Road outside Ashford, Oregon for almost 14 years. It wasn't one of those fancy subdivisions where every mailbox matched and every lawn looked like a golf course. It was older than that. Larger lots, mature oak trees, fences built decades apart by people who shook hands more often than they hired attorneys. I liked it that way. After 25 years working for county government, peace had become something I valued more than excitement. Every Friday I had the same routine. I'd stop at the little grocery store near the highway, grab a rotisserie chicken, a loaf of sourdough, maybe a six-pack if the weather looked good, then head home before sunset. That Friday felt exactly like every other Friday, until I turned into my driveway. At first my brain refused to process what I was seeing. Something looked wrong, but I couldn't immediately place it. Then I realized why the backyard looked so strangely open. My fence was gone, not damaged, not leaning, gone. 140 feet of cedar fencing that had stood there longer than I'd owned the property had vanished. The posts had been ripped out of the ground. The panels were stacked in neat piles on my neighbor's side as if they belonged to him all along. Fresh tire tracks cut through the grass. There were boot prints everywhere. Whoever had done it hadn't been careful because they weren't trying to hide anything. They thought they had every right to be there. I parked without even shutting the truck door and walked toward the property line, trying to convince myself there had to be some explanation I wasn't seeing. Maybe somebody hit the wrong address. Maybe a contractor misunderstood a work order. Maybe. Then I saw the orange survey stakes. They stretched across the back of my lot in a perfectly straight line, each one sitting nearly 6 feet inside what I had always known to be my property. Beyond them stood my neighbor, Ronald Pierce, talking with 2 construction workers while pointing toward my yard with the confidence of someone giving orders in his own living room. Ronald hadn't lived there very long, maybe 18 months. He retired early after selling a chain of auto dealerships and arrived with expensive trucks, expensive opinions, and a habit of assuming every disagreement ended in his favor because money usually solved his problems. We'd never had a huge fight, but we'd had enough uncomfortable conversations to know we weren't going to become friends. He hated old fences. He hated mature trees because they dropped leaves into his pool. He hated people telling him no. The previous spring, he casually suggested that the fence between our properties should be moved just a little because it would make both yards more symmetrical. I laughed because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. I walked straight over. "Ronald," I called out. "What exactly happened to my fence?" He barely turned around. "Needed to come down?" I waited for the rest of the sentence. It never came. "Needed? According to who?" He shrugged. "According to reality." One of the workers suddenly became fascinated with the ground beneath his boots. The other quietly climbed back into the skid steer. They knew this conversation wasn't going anywhere good. Ronald folded his arms. The old fence wasn't on the actual property line. My surveyor confirmed it this week. "So your solution was to tear down my fence without saying one word to me?" "Daniel," he sighed, smiling the way people smile when they think they're explaining something obvious to a child. "You're welcome. That thing was falling apart anyway. I'm putting in the stone garden wall. It'll improve both our properties." I looked past him and finally noticed spray paint marking out the future foundation. It wasn't just a wall. He was planning landscaping, retaining blocks, decorative lighting, the whole project. "You crossed onto my property. That's your opinion." "No," I answered quietly. "That's my deed." He chuckled. "Deeds are only as good as current surveys." Then he waved one hand dismissively. "Honestly, you should be thanking me. I'm increasing your property value for free." There are moments in life when your temper wants to take control, and then there are moments when something inside you suddenly becomes very, very calm. That's what happened to me, because while Ronald stood there convinced he'd already won, one detail kept echoing inside my head: current surveys. He had put all of his faith into a modern survey, which meant he had absolutely no idea what records still existed before everything became digital. I looked at those orange stakes one last time. then turned around without another word. Ronald laughed behind me. "Guess you figured it out." I didn't answer. He mistook silence for surrender. That would end up being the most expensive misunderstanding of his entire life. Back inside my house, I set the untouched groceries on the kitchen counter, walked down to the basement, unlocked an old gray filing cabinet I hadn't opened in years, and pulled out a set of county maps so old they still smelled faintly of dust and blueprint ink. As I spread the first survey across my workbench, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my government days. That quiet feeling that comes right before discovering a mistake everyone else overlooked. And this time, that mistake wasn't going to cost taxpayers. It was going to cost Ronald Pierce everything. People love talking about instincts, but after 25 years inside county records, I trusted paper more than intuition. Paper didn't care who had the bigger house or the newer truck. It didn't care who spoke louder in court or who hired the expensive attorney. If a document had been properly recorded and never legally replaced, it simply existed, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. I spent nearly 3 hours going through old subdivision plats, hand-drawn survey overlays, boundary adjustments from the 70s, easement amendments, and road dedication files that most people didn't even know existed. Around 10 that night, I finally unfolded a yellowed map dated June 18, 1954. My heart skipped for a second. There it was, the original recorded subdivision plat for Maple Ridge Estates, drafted long before satellite surveys and digital GIS systems. Across the back section of 6 adjoining lots ran a narrow strip marked in faded black ink, shared utility and emergency access easement, 20 feet wide, permanent, non-exclusive, protected by recorded covenant. I leaned back in my chair and smiled for the first time all day. Ronald's new survey wasn't technically wrong. It simply ignored something it wasn't designed to measure. The property boundary existed exactly where he'd been told, but ownership wasn't the issue. Usage rights were. His new stone wall wasn't crossing onto my deeded property anymore. It was about to completely block a recorded easement that legally belonged to 6 households, including mine. That distinction changes everything. A property line tells you who owns the dirt. An easement tells you what nobody is allowed to block, regardless of ownership. Ronald had spent thousands proving where his property began while completely overlooking what every owner on that property had already agreed could never be obstructed. I reached for my old address book, the paper one my wife always joked I'd never throw away, and started making calls. The first was to Melissa Grant, an attorney I'd worked beside for nearly 11 years whenever complicated easement disputes reached the county. She answered on the third ring. "Danny, this better not be another retirement fishing invitation." I laughed. "Not this time. I need your legal brain." 20 minutes later, I emailed her copies of the old plat map. She called back before I'd even finished making coffee. "Please tell me he hasn't started construction. Half the fence is already gone." There was a long pause. "He's in serious trouble." "That's what I thought." "No," she corrected me. "Worse than you think. If that easement is still active, every benefited property owner has standing, not just you." That sentence changed the entire strategy. Up until then, I'd been thinking about protecting my backyard. Now I realized Ronald had accidentally picked a fight with 5 other families who had nothing to lose by joining me. Saturday morning became a marathon of awkward introductions and unexpected conversations. The Martins had lived at the end of the easement since before I moved in. Mrs. Martin invited me inside before I even finished explaining why I was there. When she saw the map, her eyes widened. My husband used this access road with the fire department back in '98 during that brush fire. Another neighbor, Carlos Mendoza, remembered utility crews using the same corridor to repair underground lines nearly 15 years earlier. One by one, the stories lined up with the documents. The easement hadn't disappeared simply because nobody used it every week. It existed for emergencies, maintenance, and legal access whenever necessary. By lunchtime, all 5 neighbors had agreed to meet Sunday afternoon at my house. Ronald, meanwhile, appeared completely unaware of the storm forming around him. Throughout Saturday, I watched trucks delivering pallets of natural stone. Decorative iron fencing arrived, landscape lighting, irrigation pipe. He was spending money by the hour. Every delivery tightened the knot in my stomach because, strangely enough, I wasn't enjoying this. Contrary to what people assume, I didn't wake up hoping to destroy someone's investment. I wanted my fence back. I wanted my quiet weekends back. I wanted Ronald to knock on my door 2 days earlier and simply say, "Hey, I think we have a boundary issue. Can we look at it together?" Instead, pride had turned a conversation into a construction project. Sunday afternoon, 6 households crowded into my garage around an old folding table covered with maps and photocopies. Some brought coffee. Others brought legal pads. Nobody raised their voice. That was probably the strangest part. There wasn't anger in the room. There was disappointment. We all realized the same thing at roughly the same moment. Ronald hadn't just removed one neighbor's fence. He'd assumed none of us knew our own neighborhood history. Melissa arrived carrying 2 thick binders. She pointed to the original plat. This easement has never been vacated, never abandoned, never modified by court order, and never released by unanimous consent. Legally speaking, it's alive. She looked around the table, which means every single one of you has enforceable rights. Carlos whistled softly. Mrs. Martin shook her head. He never asked any of us. Melissa smiled without much humor. He didn't need permission to build on his own land. He absolutely needed permission to interfere with a shared easement. Monday morning happened faster than I expected. Melissa filed for an emergency injunction before 8 o'clock. I contacted an old colleague in the county assessor's office, not asking for favors, only asking him to review the recorded documents I'd located. Around noon, my phone rang. "Danny, we've confirmed the easement. Building department has been notified." That was quick. It gets quicker. Less than 2 hours later, I heard engines outside. 2 county vehicles pulled into Ronald's driveway. Inspectors climbed out wearing bright safety vests. Construction stopped almost immediately. I watched from my porch as one inspector measured the foundation layout while another studied copies of the recorded plot. Ronald stood beside them waving papers in obvious frustration. Even from 70 yards away, I could recognize the body language. Pointing, shrugging, arguing. At one point, he looked directly toward my house. I didn't wave. I simply sipped my coffee. About 20 minutes later, one of the inspectors nailed a bright orange notice to a temporary fence surrounding the project. "Stop work. Order." Every machine shut down. The workers packed their equipment before sunset. Ronald marched across the grass toward my driveway so fast I honestly thought he might forget where the property line actually was. "You called the county?" he demanded. "I asked them to review public records. You went behind my back." I stared at him for a moment before answering. "Behind your back, Ronald? You tore down my fence while I was at work." His jaw tightened. "This is about revenge." "No," I said calmly. "This is about paperwork." He laughed bitterly. "One phone call isn't going to stop this project." "It already did. Temporary setback." "Maybe," I shrugged. "Depends what the judge thinks." That was the first time uncertainty crossed his face. "Judge? Didn't your attorney mention the injunction hearing?" He blinked. Just once. It was enough. He hadn't known. Melissa had filed so quickly that his legal team hadn't even finished reacting before the notice arrived. For the first time since this whole mess began, Ronald looked less like a man in control and more like someone trying to remember which step he'd skipped. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning. Those 4 days felt strangely quiet. Construction equipment sat motionless beneath blue tarps while neighbors slowed their cars every time they drove past, pretending not to look. The local hardware store somehow already knew about the dispute. That's small-town life for you. News travels faster than Wi-Fi. Wednesday evening, just before sunset, Ronald surprised me by walking up my driveway without the usual swagger. He removed his sunglasses and spoke more softly than I'd ever heard. "Maybe we can work something out." I didn't answer immediately. He continued. "I could move part of the wall." "Part of it?" "Enough to satisfy everyone." I looked toward the old survey map still spread across my dining room table inside the house. "It's not my decision anymore." "What does that mean?" "It means there are 6 property owners involved now." His shoulders dropped ever so slightly. For the first time, I think he finally understood the real size of the problem. This had stopped being a disagreement between 2 stubborn neighbors. It had become 6 recorded property rights against 1 expensive mistake. And by the time we walked into court the following morning, the stone wall standing half-finished behind our homes was no longer the biggest thing Ronald Pierce had to worry about. By the time Thursday morning arrived, nobody in that courtroom cared about the missing fence anymore. What started as a neighbor tearing down a few sections of cedar had evolved into a question the judge asked within the first 10 minutes. Was this recorded easement ever legally vacated? Ronald's attorney shuffled through several folders before admitting the answer everyone already knew. "No, Your Honor." The courtroom became unusually quiet. People imagined dramatic trials with shouting lawyers and surprise witnesses. But real property cases are often decided by something much less exciting: paperwork. Melissa walked the judge through the original subdivision plat, the chain of title, decades of recorded filings, utility maintenance records, and photographs showing the exact location of the proposed wall. Every document supported the same conclusion. The easement had never disappeared. It had simply been forgotten. Ronald's surveyor testified that his boundary survey accurately reflected ownership lines, and he wasn't lying. The judge even acknowledged that point. Then came the sentence that changed everything. A boundary survey establishes ownership. It does not extinguish recorded easement rights. I watched Ronald close his eyes for just a second. He knew where this was going before anyone else in the room did. His attorney made one final attempt. He proposed shortening the wall, leaving a narrow passage, maybe negotiating shared improvements that would benefit everyone. The judge looked toward Melissa. She looked toward the six of us seated together. Without saying a word, we all gave the same answer with a simple shake of our heads. Trust had already been demolished long before the fence was. If Ronald had knocked on my door before hiring a demolition crew, there probably never would have been a lawsuit. If he had stopped construction after the first warning, maybe we could have found a compromise. But every decision he'd made was built on the assumption that money, confidence, and momentum would eventually force everyone else to accept whatever he wanted. The judge signed the order before lunch. Every section of the partially completed wall had to be removed. Ronald would pay for demolition, restoration, and legal costs associated with the injunction. More importantly, because construction had proceeded in violation of recorded property rights, the county suspended future building permits affecting that portion of his property for 2 years pending additional review. It wasn't punishment for losing the case. It was the consequence of building first and asking questions later. About 3 weeks afterward, I stood in almost the exact spot where I'd first discovered my missing fence. The same kind of machinery had returned, but this time it wasn't installing stone. It was tearing it back out. Workers who had spent days carefully setting expensive blocks into concrete now lifted those same blocks onto pallets one by one. Nobody talked much. Ronald stood near his garage with his hands in his pockets, watching $85,000 disappear in reverse. We made eye contact only once. Neither of us waved. Neither of us smiled. There wasn't any satisfaction in his face. And honestly, there wasn't much celebration in mine either. Relief, maybe. Closure. But victory? Not exactly. Property disputes have a funny way of leaving everyone a little poorer than they expected. A month later, my new cedar fence went up almost exactly where the old one had stood for decades. This time, though, every measurement had been verified against the original recorded easement, every corner documented, every reference photographed and filed away. The 6 neighbors who had barely known one another before all this ended up having a barbecue together that fall. We joked that the world's most expensive landscaping project had accidentally introduced us all. Mrs. Martin laughed and said the old easement had done its job after 70 years. It had protected access and somehow created a neighborhood at the same time. Every now and then, someone asks me if I regret taking the case all the way to court. My answer always surprises them. I never wanted court. I wanted a conversation. Lawsuits usually begin where conversations end. Ronald believed confidence was stronger than documentation. He believed newer automatically meant better. He believed that because nobody had mentioned the easement in years, it no longer mattered. But recorded history has a long memory, and the law has very little sympathy for assumptions. Looking back now, the fence was never the real issue. Respect was. Respect for boundaries, respect for neighbors, and respect for the simple idea that before changing something that affects other people, maybe you should knock on the door first. I still drive past Ronald's property from time to time. The open strip where that stone wall was supposed to stand is still there, quiet and empty, almost like the land itself remembers why nothing can ever be built across it again. Sometimes people think being quiet means being weak. They mistake patience for surrender. They assume that because someone doesn't yell, they don't know how to fight. They're usually wrong. Sometimes the strongest move is simply knowing which document to unfold and waiting until the right moment to place it on the table. Now I'm curious what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have accepted a last-minute compromise, or would you have taken the case all the way like we did? And if you were Ronald, at what point would you have admitted the mistake? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions. And honestly, that's what makes these conversations worth having. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes good neighbors are built on respect, not assumptions.